Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another one of my retrospective videos. Today we're going to be talking about Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. As I think most people know if you're watching this video, Sekiro is the latest installment in, I'm not going to say the Dark Souls series because it has nothing to do with the previous games, but at least the Dark Souls-esque, Bloodborne-esque, really freaking hard games that you feel really, really good when you overcome something. So, I played it recently on Twitch. It took me several episodes to get through, or several streams to get through, but we did eventually conquer it. Go us. We are the conquerors, my friends. So, what do I think about it? What is the end of my, playthrough? What are my conclusions? Overall, I did enjoy playing it. I'm glad I played it, but it definitely is not nearly as good as Bloodborne was. Bloodborne, if you remember from my 2018 retrospective, Bloodborne was the third best game I played. It was overcome by Yakuza 0 and Nier Automata, but it was one of my top 5 games of the year, and I can tell you definitively, Sekiro will probably not be my top 5. It might be. I might just have nothing but stinkers between now and the end of the year, but I doubt it. It was competent and it was well executed, but it didn't blow me away the same way Bloodborne did. Not even close. But let's talk about what it did right. I have heard interviews that said that what Sekiro did, the core concept of Sekiro. Okay, so let me go back a little bit. First of all, I'm going to have to start by talking out of my ass for a second, because I never played Dark Souls. I only played Bloodborne. But from what I understand, Dark Souls is very much, you stay slightly back, you watch what your opponent's doing, you try and predict what they're going to do, you avoid their attack, and then you get in a couple of hits while they recover from the attack that you avoided. So it's a very methodical, patient game. And it was fun, and a lot of people really liked it, but the developers got a little frustrated and a little, I'm not going to say bored, but they wanted a little bit more of a high energy game than what Bloodborne was, or what Dark Souls was. Dark Souls was too measured and controlled and stay back, let the guy attack, hit and response, and so they made Bloodborne. And Bloodborne had a really cool mechanic that kind of kept people from being too passive. In Bloodborne, when you took damage, if you were actually able to do damage to the enemy very, very in a short window after the damage was dealt, you would actually recover some of the health that was about to fall away from you, which engendered this really aggressive play style because you didn't want to stay back and wait for them to attack. You wanted to be up in their face, hitting them continuously, avoiding their attack, but if you just barely got hit, you were still right there in order to do the damage. You couldn't be very far away, or there was no way you'd be able to get your health back. And so Bloodborne was a much more aggressive play style. You couldn't stay away from your opponents. And again, like I said, Bloodborne was a game I played, and I really liked it. I thought it worked fantastically. And I feel like Sekiro came from a decision that they're like, okay, the problem we have with Bloodborne is that people will get up and they'll have this great in-your-face play style that we really love, but then whenever they mess up and they take damage, they get away from the boss for a second, hit a blood vial, and then go back in. And it kind of ruins what we love is the tension of having to play close and not being, having to react very, very, very swiftly and not being able to go back and bait out attacks, and we like the in-your-face playstyle. So Sekiro was designed to be even more like that. Sekiro uses what's called a posture system, and what happens is as you're playing, as you hit your opponents, you deal posture damage to them. Even if they block, they take a little bit of posture damage, but not that much. As your opponent attacks you, if you parry the attack, their posture goes up. Different side attacks that may not even do damage, but firecrackers make their posture go up. And if you max out their posture, it basically counts as killing them. It causes them to break, causes their posture to break. They aren't able to defend themselves for a second because they're knocked onto their back foot. And you, being a ninja, can take advantage of this momentary lapse in their defenses in order to stab them through the eye or something. So basically, it's if you can either kill someone by doing all their health and damage or doing all their posture and damage. And as you play through different enemies, it's better to approach in different ways. So that's... But the side effect of that is that if you back off because you took damage and you need to heal, as you're backing off and you're not staying in their face, their posture is going to recover. And the majority of enemies, you end up actually getting them through posture rather than vitality. So, in terms of this great risk and reward system where you kind of want to stay up in their face and you don't want to back off, because the second you back off, then the second you back away from your enemy, then your enemy is just going to dive straight back into you. And their posture will recover, and it's kind of like, oh, if I have to back off, I've almost like lost all of the progress I made. So the sword fighting mechanic that the game was built around are beautiful. The high points of Sekiro, without question, without flag or fail, are the battles against these samurai. You fight several samurai through the course of the game, and almost every one of them is memorable and awesome. There are a couple of the mini bosses that aren't as cool, but the actual boss samurai, like the legit bosses, are all really, really, really well done fights. There are some other bosses that aren't nearly as good, mostly against animals, that just... I kind of feel like they start to show the flaw in Sekiro. Primarily because a lot of them are so big that you can't even necessarily see the attacks coming, because the game wants you to be all up in their face, but because you're all up in their face, you can only basically see their crotch. Towards the end of the game, and this isn't really a spoiler, but there's a fight with a demon, and literally, like, the entire fight, all I could see is the thing's junk. Its hitbox seemed really weird, and it really felt like that is the kind of fight that Sekiro isn't built for. That was more of a Dark Soulsian fight. And it's funny, someone mentioned that the demon is everyone's least favorite fight because it feels like a Dark Souls fight, or it's everyone's favorite fight because it feels like a Dark Souls fight. You know, people either love the fact they put a Dark Souls fight in there, or they're just like, this is not what the system was made for. And I was definitely in the latter category. That was not what the system was made for. The problem with setting this whole system about like the thrill of sword-to-sword combat is that while it works really well against the bosses, it doesn't work particularly well against a whole bunch of enemies. Like with Bloodborne, you had some ranged attacks and you could handle a couple of guys at once, but the system really starts to struggle against parrying multiple enemies at the same time. And so to combat that, they put in a stealth system, but it ends up feeling like an Assassin's Creed game where you're all like sneaking around and trying to kill people without them seeing you, and it just, at least for me, it ended up not feeling like a Dark Souls game. And some people are like, well, it's not a Dark Souls game, it's a different IP. And I'm like, okay, so it's a different IP that isn't as fun as Dark Souls, because I think the big thing is that the Bloodborne playstyle, and what I assume is the Dark Souls playstyle, of having to very cautiously go around the map and, you know, really, really look around and pay attention to your surroundings and not let yourself get caught unaware, is so different than every other game out there that it was fascinating to go through, and it was a completely unique and a breath of fresh air. It's a type of game and a type of playstyle I've never run into before, and I loved it. And then the problem with it, of course, is that despite the fact that I love it, Sekiro comes out and it just feels not even like an Assassin's Creed game. It actually reminded me quite a bit of Dishonored, or maybe Deus Ex, with the stealth systems, and you're just kind of sneaking around, and it's just, like, at the end of the day, I'm like, oh, I've played this game before, but it was better executed. So, all the time I was spending not fighting bosses, I'm not going to say I hated it, because I didn't, but I was definitely just, you know, I'm like, okay, well, this is not new and inspiring to me. This is a game I've played before, except it gave me the tools I need in order to do this effectively, and Sekiro really didn't. So it was kind of like a little bit of a lackluster stealth system compared to games that focus on stealth. And admittedly, again, Sekiro is focused on the boss fights, but the combat system didn't do the world exploration any favors, in my opinion. Getting to the boss fights, though. As much as I love them, and I had a lot of fun fighting the bosses, the other big problem I had... There's two big problems with the boss fights. Number one. So, in the boss fights, periodically the opponents will do a perilous attack. And it's basically an attack that you really can't block. They come in 3 varieties. There's a sweep that you're supposed to jump over or dash away from. There's a stab that you're supposed to leap to one side or the other, or like dash forward, and if you dash forward, you actually grab their sword arm and yank them forward and off balance. Do a lot of posture damage if you can do that one. Or there's a grab, which basically, again, you jump over or dash away from. In order to know which one is coming, it will give you a signal that they're doing a perilous attack, but in order to know which of the 3 attacks they're doing, you have to look at your opponent. You know, if they start to pull their sword arm back, they're about to do a stab, versus if they, you know, hold it out to one side and drop it towards the ground, they're about to do a sweep. Cool. Great system. Except for the fact that the enemies you're fighting are the same size you are. And so, over and over and over again, I would end up in a situation where I can't actually see what my opponents are doing because they, you know, the camera is behind Sekiro, and Sekiro is between the camera and the enemy. So how the heck am I supposed to see whether he's pulling his sword back or if he's like lowering it towards the ground when all I can see is the back of Sekiro's head? Like, it's not quite as bad as I'm making out to be, but it's really hard to really pay attention to what your opponent is doing when your own character is between the camera and them. So, that was the one. I mean, overall, the one great thing about the Dark Souls games is that they all have what I'm going to call legitimate difficulty. They all have the moment of where the difficulty you have at a boss is because you haven't learned the boss yet. There's nothing else causing it. It's not going to be one of these, because a lot of games have what I'll call artificial difficulty, where there will be attacks that come with no real warning, and the only thing you can do is memorize the order that they happen in. And Dark Souls isn't really known for that. But here, there definitely were moments where I was like, well, he's either stabbing or he's sweeping, so I'm going to dash forward and hope it's a stab. So that was pretty frustrating. The other problem that the combat has is I really just feel like... So, in Bloodborne, you could hold up to 20 blood vials. And you could expand that as time went on. Whereas in Sekiro, you start off holding 1. And even at the end of the game, you get up to a maximum of 10 if you thoroughly farm and find absolutely everything. So you end up with these really long multi-phase boss fights with significantly less healing than you had before. And the enemies, if they hit you, will do like 80% of your health and damage. It ended up being, in my opinion, slightly too hard. And I'm not going to be one of these games like, the game needs to be easier. But what my experience was is that with Bloodborne, and I know I compare everything to Bloodborne, but it's the same developer, I kind of have to. With Bloodborne, I would go in against an enemy and I would, you know, get my ass kicked. But I would learn from it. And I would understand, okay, this is what he did. These are the moves he was doing. This is what I need to do to overcome it. And over time, I would start to see all of his different attacks and figure out ways to get around them. And once I figured out the ways to get around all of them, then I won the fight. With Sekiro, it was more like you do the same thing. You'd go in, you get your ass kicked, you'd figure out the different attacks, you would see the different attack strings he had. But then once you figured out all the attack strings, he would still kill you another 10 or so times until you got perfect at parrying all of his attack strings, or perfect at reacting in time in order to avoid the attacks. And so the 10 or 15 tries between when you figured out when you actually killed the boss, by the time you finally took the boss down, it wasn't the same sense of, yeah, I beat it, I'm the best, wah! It was instead, you were just like, fucking finally. Bloodborne required you to have mastery of its combat systems. Sekiro required you to have them perfected, and very often when you finally beat the boss, you'd have like 5 healing flasks yet. It wouldn't be a close fight that you just barely pulled out. It would be like, well, yeah, I never get hit anymore. I've done this damn boss enough times that I'm no longer in any danger of taking damage. So it would go from die, slaughter. And that was frustrating. You felt like you died significantly more times after you already had the fight figured out and you just had to execute it. And that's not the way the previous games were. Like, once you figured it out, the difference between knowledge and victory was very, very short. So it felt rewarding versus, okay, yeah, I know, oh my god, type of thing. And the last thing, and I know I'm complaining a lot about Sekiro, and I apologize, but you know me, I'm very critical, and I look at games very closely. The last thing about Sekiro is that, unlike Bloodborne, and unlike what I understand Dark Souls to be, the world just felt really shallow. Like, you know, Bloodborne had this great eldritch horror, you don't really know what's going on, you're constantly finding out new information. Like, after I beat the game, we went out and found a plot analysis that was like over 100 pages long. It was beautiful. I never got through all of it, but it was really, really interesting just how deep that world went. And with Sekiro, the plot is super, super easy to digest, and it's just like, oh yeah, you're a shinobi, and your master wants to stop your resurrection because it's messing up Japan. And there were some kind of cool things. There were some interesting concepts. There was like worms that were, you know, taking over people's bodies. But overall, it just seemed so much more banal and straightforward than Bloodborne was. And that's not bad. You don't have to have a, like, oh, only good games are confusing. That's not what I'm saying. But one of the great things about Bloodborne is that you had to figure out what was going on. And with Sekiro, I just feel like they kind of just handed it to me. And we're just like, okay, well, there's nothing really to... The game just felt really straightforward, and because of that, there was nothing really to dive into. I remember, Mibu Village is an area that you get to kind of late in the game. You can get to it a lot easier than I did, but it was so awesome when I first got there, because it was finally, oh, hey, here's something that's actually going on, rather than just go around and do whatever the Lord tells you to do. But, at the end of the day, like I said, I know I spent about 15 minutes bitching about minor things in the game, and again, I don't dislike the game. I've enjoyed playing it. It's very well executed, and it's a lot of fun. If you haven't played Bloodborne, and you just hear me shitting on the game over and over and over again, play Bloodborne first. Bloodborne is a better game, but, you know, it's interesting. When I played The Quiet Man, which is hands down the worst game I've ever played, I didn't make one of these retrospectives, I don't think. And if I did, it wouldn't have gone on this long, I don't believe. Because The Quiet... You know, whenever you just have an unadulterated, you know, avalanche of shit, you're just like, yeah, this game sucks, don't play it. Like, the longer I spend picking apart a game, unless I'm doing it just because I'm really pissed off and I want to, you know... piss in its Cheerios. For the most part, the more little nuances and the more things I'm like, this could have done better, this could be done better, it's because I want the game to be amazing. The game is good, but I'm seeing small problems with it. And that's the thing. You know, just because you like a game doesn't mean the game can't have flaws. And the better a game is, the more those flaws stick with me. So, don't read this retrospective or listen to this retrospective and think that I think Sekiro is a bad game or that it's not a worthy, you know, successor. I do think that they made some missteps, and I certainly hope that we go back to a Bloodborne style era of game, or if we do Sekiro, at the very least that they give you enough room to make mistakes without having you shouldn't have to be perfect to progress. Being excellent should be sufficient.